Let's talk about invasive species. So this is a picture of one called Kudzu, which is pretty common in a place where I used to live in South Carolina. So basically, there's two terms we're going to use today. One is called introduced species, and another one is called invasive species, and they're very much related to each other. So an introduced species is simply an animal, plant, insect species that has been transported from the native habitat where it evolved and it's been brought somewhere else by humans for a variety of reasons. Now, when we say it's an introduced species, this may imply intention. We might have intentionally brought it over. We might have done it accidentally, but we've introduced it to a new environment. So many crop plants, for instance, like here, a goguma, is that a goguma? Goguma, okay, very popular here. Well, guess what? It's from South America. It's not from here. It's brought over, and it's grown as a crop plant. So crops often, like tomatoes and corn, wheat, is very common for human beings as they move from one part of the world to another to bring with them the food species that they're accustomed to. And this includes meat species like cows or sheep. Sometimes we bring pets with us, right? So people, like, oh, I really want to have this kind of tropical fish, or I really want this kind of bird, or this kind of, a cat, whatever. So we bring it over as pets. And sometimes we do it intentionally, say, well, there's a problem with this one kind of insect, so I'll bring over another kind of insect that will prey upon it. So sometimes we do it for pest control reasons, or I'll bring over this caterpillar to eat this plant. So those are the main reasons why we intentionally introduce species from one place to another. Sometimes we just do it accidentally without meaning to. But now an invasive species is what we really want to talk about, because invasive species definitely have an impact on the environment. So they're something we need to talk about in an environmental science class. So an invasive species is an introduced species, but it's one that adapts to its new environment. Typically, it's one that's going to be able to reproduce rapidly, making new offspring, basically almost at its biotic potential. And it typically has very few, if any, predators in its new environment, at least once it gets to a certain size. And usually what happens then is it's going to cause economic or environmental harm as a consequence of its rapid growth and spread. So basically, in order for a species to be considered invasive, it has to be well adapted to feed and reproduce in its new environment. And one of the most important things is it doesn't have any predators that are going to keep its population down. And because in this new environment, nobody is evolved to prey upon it, it can grow. So if you think about when things normally evolve, as one species evolves, there's a predator species that evolves with it. We call this coevolution. And so because they evolve together naturally, things tend to stay in balance. But what happens is when I take a species from an environment in which it has co-evolved with a predator, and I put it in another environment where there is no co-evolved predator, that's when we get problems. That the check that would normally hold the population down isn't there. Now, eventually, you'll get these. You'll always get to a carrying capacity, right? There'll always be density-dependent factors that eventually keep the population down. Unfortunately, that can happen after a tremendous amount of economic and ecologic harm has been done. So let's just look at an example of the two. So let's just say parrots. Okay, so if there are examples of parrots that have been released in places like I've seen them in Greece, I've seen them in San Francisco, I've seen them in Italy, and these were all introduced. They're non-natives to these areas. People brought them as pets, and they got away. They fly. Go figure. But the thing is, when they get to this new environment, they're not becoming invasive. And why not? Let's just think about in North America. Okay, so you release parrots in San Francisco. Well, look at this. Their beaks are designed for eating almonds and other sort of nuts that are endemic to where they come from, but they don't need those beaks for where they are. So that they're not really well adapted to eating the nut species in their new environment. So that they're not able to feed that well. They typically build their nests in holes that exist in very large old trees, which there's not a lot of in their new environment. And they're predators. There's snakes and there's hawk species that prey upon them. So it keeps their numbers in check. So they're out there, they're reproducing, but their carrying capacity is really low. Now let's talk about Burmese pythons. So people brought them over as pets. that people like to have snake as pets, and people sometimes when they unfortunately, what happens is people are like, oh, I don't want this pet anymore. I got a new job. I'm moving. I don't know what to do with it. It got too big. What do I do with this python? I just can't bring myself to kill this animal. I'd feel so wrong. I'll just let him go. Go be free, little python. Okay. Well, what the problem is, it happened in North America. They got out in certain parts of North America, and it turns out, man, they're really well adapted to hunting the kind of birds and mammals and reptiles that they find in their new environment. So there's plenty of food. Their nesting behavior is conducive to the new environment, so they're not limited in that respect. And once they get to a certain size, there is like nothing other than humans that's capable of killing them. So as a result, you have access to food, you have access to reproduction, and you don't have predators. That is an equation for an invasive species to just take hold. And what happens is they cause a lot of problems. So here's what they do. One thing is they outcompete uh, or prey upon endemic species. In other words, they eat all the food, so the endemic species its numbers drop or even goes extinct, or maybe it preys upon them. And so if it's able to eat a species in its new environment, that species is not adapted to avoiding that particular predator. Well, they sometimes go extinct. In the case here, this brown tree snake in Asian islands has gotten loose and just driven many endemic species to extinction, because islands often have their own small populations of endemic species. Or you can have like this here, so like kudzu, like I said, in South Carolina where I grew up. Look, it just covers everything. So it basically alters its environment by blanketing it, or sometimes it changes the soil chemistry, so it can significantly change the environment. And if you take a forest and do this to it, there's many species that are going to be impacted by this. So introducing these species can cause a lot of problems, and it can often be difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of invasive species once it's taken hold. It's worth noting that a lot of them, at least the aquatic ones, have come about because of what's called ballast water. So I think I told you my younger son works on a ship, and so basically what happens is ships have to bring water in when they offload cargo so that the ship doesn't flip over, so that it keeps the ship in the water, like we call it ballast water. And then basically if they start bringing more stuff in, they have to like offload the water. So what happens is they bring water in one part of the world, sail to another part of the world, and they have to take that water out. And when they do that, they end up accidentally taking an aquatic organism from one part of the world and introducing it to another one. Now, the rules, at least in the United States, are you have to switch out your ballast water at sea. It's one of the things my son says is kind of a scary thing that he's in charge of doing, because you can cause your ship to capsize at sea, but it's got to be done to avoid the risk of bringing these invasive species into another country. Insect species, a lot of times they come in, a lot of them burrow into wood, so wood will have it in there, or they might get into shipping containers. So it's quite easy for insect species in the modern world environment, especially with airplanes, to get moved from continent to continent. A lot of times people buy them as pets and they get away. And sometimes people intentionally say, like, I want to get rid of this one species. There's this plant species that's a problem, so I have this one invasive species. I know, I'll bring in this caterpillar. Well, then that caterpillar becomes an invasive species. So it's very difficult to manage a species, once it begins to grow on its own in an environment. Now, a classic example I'll end with is the Asian carp. There's a variety, there's like 4 species of them. Collectively, they just call them Asian carp. But basically, the one in particular is the silver carp. It was brought in from, I believe, China, maybe Vietnam, in the I want to say 70s. Basically, down here, I think in Louisiana, there was these catfish as a popular fish. So people have these aquaculture operations. We have like a large pond that you build near a river, because you need to bring water in from the river to fill your pond. So they have this pond. They raise a lot of catfish. They throw food out there. But the problem is algae builds up and it kills the catfish. So people thought, how do you get rid of algae? I know. There's these carp. These are the ones you see along the Tanchan River when you walk over the bridges here in South Korea. Now, it's not the exact same species, but that is a carp species. So people said, look, there's this one carp species, man, it really eats algae. So they brought it over for the purpose of solving a problem, right? I'm going to bring in this one species, and it's going to fix this problem I have with algae in my catfish farm. Well, what happened was a flood occurred, and the ponds, the river came over its bank, and now the ponds are underwater, and the fish just swim out into the river. They start reproducing. It turns out they get big real fast, and they have lots and lots of babies. So they're an R-selected species that put out tons and tons of babies. And once they get to be a certain size, there's nothing in that ecosystem that can eat them. So they get huge and they reproduce. And what's happened is, in the course of several decades, they've basically filled up this the middle of America. These river systems are just filled with them now, and they're quickly out competing all these other fish species. They're totally upsetting the food web, and so many of the fisheries that people depended upon, like the catfish fishery, for instance, they're being depleted of their fish because they're being outcompeted by these carp. And these things have made their ways all the way up near the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes has a tremendous fishery operation, and these fish are right up against them. The only way they're right now able to keep them out is there's this section of canal, and they've literally put in these electrocution grids to try to shock these fish, and they try to swim it like this gauntlet of electricity. But the problem is people have boats. And so when a person goes out into, say, the Mississippi River, he might pick up eggs or little tiny fish by accident. And then if they put their boat here, they get loose. It's going to be almost impossible to keep them out of here. It's just so easy to accidentally spread them. So the last thing I'm going to show you is this. It's pretty remarkable. Take a look at this. I'm just going to be quiet unless you watch this. But you know what? I'm just going to show you a clip real quick, and I'm just going to encourage you to watch this on your own on our presentation. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute this, and I'm just going to fast forward and just show you what we got here. Okay. This is what it looks like. When you disturb these rascals, they just start going nuts, and they start jumping. These are silver carp, and there's so many of them on these rivers. And what happens is people get injured by them. People get hit by them when they're driving down the river. Like, they put little catchers on the front of this to try to stop them from hitting them. They're like everywhere. There's so many of them, and they're not any good for eating. So nobody wants to eat them. And there's just so many of them. So anyway, I'm just going to let you. Let's see this. Here's another good scene of it. Let's see. Here we go. Anyway, I'm going to encourage you to watch this YouTube video because it is pretty remarkable and pretty informative. Okay, guys. Well, that's got it then. Oops, it's not going to let me out of here. So I'm just going to stop right